we can start now. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar on exploring biodiversity credits. A couple of housekeeping rules and notifications. We are recording this webinar and we'll be able to send it to you all after the session. And also to let you know, please do put any questions that you have throughout the webinar into the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer kind of as many as we can at the end with the time that we have left. And I'm just very much looking forward to this engaging and very informative webinar for forward-thinking corporates and private sector actors like yourselves to learn a bit more about biodiversity credits and to kind of understand on our side a bit more from you what you might be looking for in these going forward. I want to introduce our panelists today. We have Toril Shaw, who's the Biodiversity Coordinator at Plan Vivo, Rosalie Wright, the Solent Seascape Project Coordinator at Blue Marine Foundation, and Nicola Rodewald, the Director of Nature-Based Solutions at goodcarbon. Toril, I'll let you kick off.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kaya. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. I'm going to start this webinar by introducing you to biodiversity credits and a little bit about the current landscape, and then talk to you about our developing Plan Vivo biodiversity standard and give you a feel for some of the decisions we've been making when designing a certification for generating biodiversity credits. So, a brief background to who Plan Vivo is. We are a charitable foundation and a voluntary carbon certification. We've been operating in the space for over 25 years, and our model really puts smallholders, Indigenous peoples, and local communities at the forefront of the design. And these people are often the most impacted by the climate crisis, and we try to enable them and empower them to make their own sustainable land use choices. So our model is very holistic, whereby although carbon is the enabler, we try to promote long-term livelihood benefits, improve resilience, and enhance biodiversity conservation. So what are biodiversity credits? Biodiversity credits represent a standardized unit of positive biodiversity outcomes. They can be generated through biodiversity restoration or conservation activities that are monitored and verified over time. Importantly, these credits are not aimed at offsetting, but rather towards a contribution for nature positive. So over the last year, we've seen a growing interest in biodiversity credits. And why is this? From a business perspective, we see an opportunity to invest in nature, and biodiversity credits provide this mechanism to provide verifiable and positive biodiversity outcomes that can be used to report against targets or different disclosures. They also provide confidence that these activities have been applied and implemented against good practice. From the ground, with nature stewards, custodians, and various conservation practitioners, biodiversity credits offer an opportunity to scale up the funding towards activities related to conservation and restoration of biodiversity, and make this funding targeted to biodiversity-aligned practices. More broadly, other stakeholders are looking to biodiversity credits to increase their confidence that different actors are acting responsibly towards meeting our global goals towards nature recovery. So we are building on lessons learned from the carbon market and trying to develop synergies between the two markets. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with carbon credits, but just to highlight the differences between the two market-based systems, we know carbon credits are a compensatory approach to represent emissions reductions. They are quantified by a ton of CO2 and represent gains towards net zero, often tied to an operational footprint. On the other hand, we have biodiversity credits, which are non-compensatory. They do still represent measured outcomes for biodiversity restoration and or conservation. And in the current nascent market are quantified by different methodologies and unit types. They represent gains towards no net loss and a contribution for nature positive, and go beyond the value chain and beyond the mitigation hierarchy. So what does the current biodiversity landscape look like? Just to say that biodiversity as in its nature is very complicated. It has many aspects and facets that can be measured and tracked over time. And there are numerous organizations, a few of which are listed here, that are working on various methodologies and approaches to quantify and certify biodiversity credits. So in this complicated nascent landscape, we're seeing a lot of variation in approaches, in metrics and indicators, but this is okay because biodiversity is complicated and some aspects are more or less applicable to different environments. When trying to understand how these different approaches can be assessed, Plan Vivo are looking for high integrity under certain principles and criteria, and that these approaches can have certified outcomes. They're developed through scientifically informed metrics that can be peer-reviewed and expertly informed, preferably by local or regional experts. They have the opportunity to be community-led and participatory. And then the outcomes can be third-party audited, and the credits are issued via independent registries. So these are some of the key criteria that help us to define how to assess these biodiversity credits. This webinar is really focused on biodiversity credits in a voluntary market, but I will briefly mention the difference between biodiversity credits and biodiversity offsets. Although the two may be similar in design, they do differ in their use. So biodiversity offsets are used to compensate for industry or business impacts on the environment, and should be used in a locally driven aspect, or they should be location specific. Biodiversity credits are voluntary and enable investors or businesses to make a positive contribution to the nature positive movement. So as we see many of these different approaches coming out, Plan Vivo, along with Flora and Fauna and Carbon Tanzania, have done some work to try and define the principles and the attributes that define biodiversity credits and markets more broadly. We're not the only ones doing this type of work. There has been high integrity principles that have come out from the World Economic Forum, IIED, pollination. And for Plan Vivo, high integrity biodiversity credits represent real additional verifiable benefits, not just for biodiversity, but also for people and climate. As I said, we are looking for approaches that are scientifically informed and that are used to incentivize landowners and communities to protect or restore these important habitats. As well as these principles, we're trying to look for approaches that can align with much larger global initiatives, many of which are trying to meet targets from the recent CBD COP under the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this brings me to the second part of my talk, which is going to be introducing you to PV Nature. This is the Developing Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard. And hopefully this will provide you a clearer pathway towards a high integrity opportunity for financing nature recovery. So what is PV Nature? This is a biodiversity standard or a certification to enable the issuance of biodiversity credits and certificates. It's a mechanism to channel responsible investment into the hands of indigenous peoples and local communities, so that we can effectively mobilize resources and incentivize biodiversity conservation and restoration. So why has Plan Vivo decided to engage in this space? We're building on 25 years of experience in the voluntary carbon market and increased recognition of the current state of global biodiversity loss. So Plan Vivo really want to broaden its impact by learning from and building on synergies with the carbon market, and ensuring that these credits are issued through credible mechanisms on independent registries and have undergone third-party verification. So as I said, the credits generated under PV Nature are not to be used as offsets, but rather as a contribution towards nature positive. So as we have been developing this certification and learning from our experience in the voluntary carbon market, there's been a lot of decisions we've had to make and trade-offs that we've had to make. However, based on the experience, we also have learned that there are some non-negotiables, some standards that need to be set as a minimum. And these include having a holistic approach whereby we increase the resilience of not just nature, but people and climate as well. That we have transparency and accountability in how benefits are equitably shared, particularly with those custodians of nature, such as Indigenous peoples and local communities, and have transparency and accountability in the trade of the biodiversity credits. We want to ensure that outcomes are real, robust, and verifiable, so that we are genuinely accelerating the progress towards our global goals for nature recovery. So now I'm just going to give you a little bit of insight into what I mean by a holistic approach and how, as a standard setter, we achieve this from our project requirements. When trying to deliver social impact, we require all our projects to use a participatory and inclusive process. This means they must conduct detailed stakeholder engagement and consultations, develop a participatory governance structure, including how the community can be involved in the monitoring of the biodiversity change or no change. Stakeholders must be engaged through free, prior, informed consent processes and have implemented mechanisms for displaying grievance or any feedback. Importantly, for Plan Vivo, we need to see an equitable benefit sharing mechanism whereby we stipulate at least 60% of the revenue from the sale of the credits must go directly back into the decision-making hands of the custodians of nature, so Indigenous peoples and local communities. And finally, to ensure that practice is done in the most responsible way, Plan Vivo conduct environmental and social safeguarding so that we can try to account for and mitigate as any potential risks associated with the project. So, of course, when trying to achieve a holistic approach, we need to make sure our requirements for the certification also deliver positive biodiversity and climate impact in addition to the social impact. And to achieve this, we need to ensure that projects apply relevant interventions that align with the regional objectives, along with suitable biodiversity monitoring approaches. We sense check these aspects of the project design with our technical review panel. So this is a body of external experts with specific regional expertise to help us understand and sense check the project design. We need to ensure that the project is participatory with a clear plan for capacity building and knowledge sharing, so that together there is a realistic project logic that delivers impact beyond the 20 years of the project lifetime. Okay, so now I come to quantifying biodiversity. Just like in carbon, we need to be able to measure change or no change in biodiversity. However, unlike carbon, where you have a single unit that represents a ton of carbon dioxide, biodiversity is much more complicated. There are many aspects that you can measure over time. And therefore, before actually deciding how to measure and what to measure, there are actually some important methodological choices in the design that we had to make before. And these include ensuring the community can engage and be involved in the biodiversity monitoring itself, that we use a science-based approach that results in outcomes that align with those global goals that we need to meet. We are trying to design an approach that can be scaled up, but remains feasible and affordable, and that we derive evidence-based results that can be compared across projects and are replicable. That the data generated from these projects can be independently audited by third parties, and that we minimize any opportunities for gaming the system. So with these methodology choices in mind, we have developed the approach for two project types. The first will be conservation projects, where they will be conserving areas with existing high biodiversity value and need to show eligibility of this high biodiversity value. And the second is restoration projects, where they will be restoring areas that have been previously degraded. So what will we be measuring exactly? We'll be measuring change in species data. So this is things like birds, plants, fish, bats, etc. And combining the species data with habitat data, which tells us about the land use and the overall ecosystem quality. The data will be measured annually, and this is really to be able to have a more reliable picture as possible of understanding change over time. And the data will be measured using digital data recorders. So this is things like camera traps, acoustic monitors, other high-resolution imagery, which not only makes it easy for anybody to engage, particularly local communities, to take leadership of that monitoring approach, but also makes auditability of the data more reliable. The collected data will be analyzed by machine learning platforms, as well as human experts, preferably regional expertise. And the aim is to track general trends in ecosystem health over time. So we cannot aim to complete a census of every single living organism in a particular landscape, because that would be too expensive and too difficult. But rather, we are using well-informed, well-studied indicators to track ecosystem change over time. And we will be reporting this in a unit of percentage change per hectare per year. So when considering the two project types I mentioned in the previous slide, conservation projects will be rewarded with conservation Plan Vivo conservation certificates for maintaining their baseline. And for restoration projects will be rewarded with restoration certificates for gains relative to the baseline. So a quick slide on what will be generated from a Plan Vivo certification. Projects will be generating Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates, also known as PVBCs, and one PVBC represents evidence-based outcomes for biodiversity, climate, and communities that have been additional and have been verified. So as I've said throughout my talk, all of these components are very much interlinked, and enhancing one aspect leads to the resilience of all of these, particularly around enhanced ecosystem services and resilience towards climate change. All our projects will contain recognition of carbon sinks and stores, trying to unlock the synergies between the two markets. The impact of these projects should create improved livelihoods with protected rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities through inclusive community development. So how has this process been developing over the last 18 months? It has been very inclusive and very collaborative. We've been working on this with a number of key partners, many of which are joining this call today and hosting this webinar. We've had 2 working groups made up of various actors, including academics, project developers, market actors, conservation organizations, who've helped us navigate through this new space. We've had input from projects on the ground, helping us to understand the feasibility and practicability of these projects, particularly from different ecosystems, different environments, and importantly, different types of stakeholders. We've had a very iterative process. So we've received reviews and feedbacks through 2 public consultations and 2 technical reviews, where we've gathered input from a range of actors, including from a scientific perspective. And as I said, it has been very participatory. We've had a collaborative approach with lots of key partners helping us to communicate and engage on this space. We're trying to align and network with much more global initiatives such as the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and the World Economic Forum. So that's kind of the progress over the last 18 months. Over the next coming months, we will be finalizing our documentation, continuing to work closely with our pilot and launch projects, and looking forward to launching the standard before the end of this year. So this brings me to the last slide that I wanted to cover today. This is really highlighting on how all of this is relevant and what opportunity is truly created from engaging in biodiversity markets and biodiversity credits. For us as a standard setter, we believe that this contribution of biodiversity credits through scientific methodologies, well-acknowledged standards, clear divisibility of the financial contribution, and how the outcomes are measured and quantified really lead to creating and fostering trust in the market from businesses and industries like yourselves. And this in turn lowers that financial barrier to enter and provide contribution to landscape level project interventions. We also think that this provides a direct contribution to meeting many of the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework itself specifically cites that biodiversity credits are one of the innovative schemes that can help mobilize domestic, international, and public and private sector resources. And just to mention a few of the targets, these are not all, but specifically PV Nature aims to meet many of them, but these are some of the ones we highlight. Target 1 and 2 to conserve 30% of global land and seas by 2030, significantly reduce the impacts of invasive species by at least 50%, reduce impacts on climate change, increase the level of financial resources, and of course, build and strengthen capacity, particularly related to technology and especially in the global south. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and pass on to my colleague, Rosalie, to tell you about the Solent.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rosalie. I'm the Solent Seascape Project Coordinator at Blue Marine Foundation, which is a marine conservation charity based in London. We're dedicated to restoring ocean health and addressing overfishing. Today, I'll be giving a brief overview of the Solent Seascape project, and we're really excited because this is one of Plan Vivo's trial projects for the biodiversity credit methodology, which you've just heard about from Toril. The project is a 5-year initiative to restore multiple habitats in the Solent Strait, which is the area between the Isle of Wight and mainland England. We've been funded by the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes programme, which is managed by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative for the 5-year duration of this project. And it involves 10 different organisations, which you can see here, and is led by Blue Marine. These organisations range from local ones to government department and advisory bodies, as well as other environmental NGOs. We're all working to address the issues that face marine and coastal environments throughout the Solent. Just waiting for the slides to change. There we go. And as some of you may know, if you've ever been to the Solent, it's a pretty busy and highly degraded area. Ooh, it seems to be lagging a little bit. And has a population of over 1 million people. So it's home to one of the busiest waterways in Europe. It's a really complex network of harbours and ports and sandbanks and estuaries. But it's also home to some amazing wildlife. So we have some incredibly biodiverse seagrass meadows and world-renowned seabird nesting sites. So the long-term vision of this project is as a partnership to protect and restore these habitats in the Solent, and tip the balance of this seascape from a degraded state to a naturally expanding, connected and productive ecosystem. And some of our main project aims, which we'll show on the next slide when it eventually changes, include restoring a set number of 4 key habitats. So we're aiming to restore around 25 hectares of habitat. I'm not sure why it's not changing slides. There we go. And we're also working with a number of local volunteers. So we're aiming to reach 500 people and 100 marine champions who will be helping to spread the message of this project over the next 5 years and beyond the duration of the project itself. And these relate to the 5 different work streams that we have to achieve longer term system recovery in the Solent. And they include, first off, collaborating with the Solent community to co-create a long-term seascape recovery plan, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. Actively restoring the 4 key habitats that I'll explain in the next slide, assessing vital ecosystem service benefits from these habitats and their restoration, which links in a little bit to the biodiversity credits, empowering the local community by sharing knowledge, building capacity and increasing access to our seascapes, which ties in with Plan Vivo's community focus, and finally, developing mechanisms for upscaling restoration by working with government and regulators. And this is where the biodiversity credit scheme really comes in, as we've been lucky to receive funding to start this large-scale project for the next 5 years, but the long-term aim won't be possible without a sustainable finance mechanism to keep up the restoration work and also the habitat management that will be involved. Hopefully it's going to change to the next one. There we go. So this project is the first seascape scale restoration project in the UK. meaning that we're working to restore connected coastal and marine habitats at scale across the Solent instead of taking a single habitat focus. And the focal habitats that we've chosen are seagrass meadows, salt marshes, seabird nesting sites, and oyster reefs. And these are the habitats that we'll be actively restoring in addition to providing passive protection techniques. And these habitats are naturally present in the Solent. They've just seriously lost their extent over the recent years. So we're working to bring back the benefits that these habitats have brought to the Solent in the past, such as acting as vital carbon stores, providing nursery grounds for commercially important fish, protecting coastal homes from erosion and sea level rise, enhancing water quality, and improving social well-being by providing areas for local people and tourists to explore their environment. And the idea is that by taking a seascape approach, so multi-habitat focused, we can restore the systems as a whole instead of a single habitat, and this could lead to a healthier and more abundant seascape. Go to the next slide. And as part of the project, and also tying into the Plan Vivo biodiversity credit methodology, we have a really comprehensive scientific monitoring plan. So this is allowing us to collect baseline data about how the habitats are functioning in the Solent already, and how over the next 5 years, as we actively restore these habitats, how that will enhance biodiversity in various ecosystem services like the ones I've just mentioned. And this is led by our partners at the University of Portsmouth. And the monitoring plan includes things such as diver surveys and drop-down video surveys and small fish surveys that you can see pictured here, which we use to assess how the levels of biodiversity are doing across the 4 different habitats. And in accordance with Plan Vivo's monitoring requirements, we'll be taking this data for the next 5 years to build a really strong evidence base about how biodiversity is changing across this region. And excitingly, we've already seen at one of our restored oyster reef sites that there's been an increase in biodiversity and a decrease in invasive and non-native species that have been outcompeting some of the species we want to see, which is a really exciting sign already. However, as you can probably see from the list here, this comprehensive monitoring system isn't cheap when you consider the equipment, maintenance, and personnel time that goes into conducting these surveys. And some of the money that would be generated by Plan Vivo's biodiversity credit system would go towards this monitoring and allow the project to continue doing it long after the 5 years of funding that we've received from the ELP. And the data generated from the monitoring is really important, not just for the credits, but also understanding what's present in the Solent and making a case for the protection of these amazing habitats in future. However, the data won't work alone. Another key part of the project is community engagement, helping to increase access and understanding of coastal habitats in the Solent community and wider afield. So we're working with local communities to try and encourage shifts in behaviours and local management practices by working together to understand the barriers at the moment to seascape restoration. And the 100 marine champions I mentioned earlier, we're working with as part of the project, are really critical to this. So they'll be involved in co-designing the outreach and engagement strategies that we take as a project. And we'll also be equipped with the skills and knowledge through various training initiatives that we'll have to continue promoting the messages of this project after the 5-year mark. So they'll be a really important part of the community in deciding how the benefits from the biodiversity credits will be distributed. And secondly, this ties into another one of the project goals I mentioned earlier, the Seascape Recovery Plan, which is a comprehensive plan of action for managing the Solent's natural habitat after the 5-year project finish. So this will be co-developed with the local community and also through the local stakeholders and end users of this plan. And through setting up a series of local stakeholder-led working groups, for example, one on volunteering or sustainable recreation practices, the idea is that the local community can take ownership of the project once the funding from ELP finishes and the 5 years are over. And initially, this will be led by groups like the harbour authorities and local organisations, but ultimately the stakeholders in this region. And sustainable finance mechanisms such as biodiversity credits will be essential to achieving this aim, because having an income from the biodiversity credits would facilitate the habitat management and monitoring to keep going without external funding that we've got at the moment. And the 60% of funds that Plan Vivo allocate to the local community would also be managed by these stakeholders, likely overseen by existing Solent groups, such as the Solent Forum, if any of you are familiar with the area. And in an area as large and as complex as this, community and stakeholder engagement activities are really important to making sure that the project has local buy-in before this stage. So over the next 5 years, we'll be working really hard to make sure that the Seascape Recovery Plan really meets the needs of the local communities, and things like the biodiversity credits can go towards supporting local ambitions as well as nature's. And onto my final slide. The role of biodiversity credits, as I've mentioned throughout the talk, is therefore a really, really important part of the project, especially in an area like the Solent, which might not be where many people automatically think of biodiversity credits coming from. Things like carbon gains might not be as easy because the habitats are fragmented and the opportunity for tourism isn't as high. So something like biodiversity credits could be a really important sustainable finance mechanism for this kind of project. And they'll allow us to prove the benefits of seascape restoration through the monitoring that we'll be doing as part of Plan Vivo's methods. And it'll be a really unique and timely case study to prove that restoration efforts are really important, and just as important as other areas in heavily used areas like the Solent. So we really want to raise awareness of the biodiversity benefits from this project, and also connect like-minded organizations in the private sector with our work through something like a biodiversity credit scheme. And finally, the focus on benefit sharing with the local community is a really important feature. It's critical that the biodiversity benefits that come from this project go back towards those who are most connected to these environments, and to promote local stewardship and evidence their importance. So we've been really proud to work with Plan Vivo on this high integrity and community focused methodology. And that is everything from me. Over to Nicola, she's around.
Hi, I'm Nicola from Goodcarbon. Thank you, Rosalie. I just had to find my unmute button, which disappeared from my computer at this moment, but it's come back. So yeah, after hearing about the methodology for biodiversity credits from Toril and seeing how it can be applied to a project from Rosalie, I would like to share some views on how corporates can engage and why they should engage with biodiversity credits. First, a very short introduction from Goodcarbon, because we might not be that familiar to everybody. So we are a young impact-driven company and foundation from Berlin in Germany, and we have the mission to shift the focus of the global capital to conserve and restore our precious ecosystem. And we do that through several dimensions. We provide access to carbon and biodiversity credits for corporates and investors. We also develop our own carbon and biodiversity projects that can be invested in. And we have our Goodcarbon Intelligence, where we work on new approaches for nature-based solutions and also develop a quality framework to enhance the integrity of the voluntary carbon market and biodiversity market. It's very important to us. Let me see if I can change the slide now. Sometimes it's a little tricky. No, it's going back. Interesting. Thank you. I don't know whether it was me or somebody else, but this is the right slide. So it's very important to really motivate corporates to engage with biodiversity credits. Why? Because the biodiversity crisis is probably more dangerous and more threatening than the climate crisis, and there needs to be a lot of investments into nature to be able to conserve and restore nature until 2050. You might know this study from UNEP that shows that we need about $8 trillion to be moved into nature until 2050. And there are many movements, initiatives, and actions taken from governments, but this is all too slow and not enough. So there is still a $4 trillion gap to be closed, and corporates have to take responsibility because they can also act faster. And of course, they're very important stakeholders in our whole economy and in the whole nature system. I'm trying to change the slide again, yet it's difficult. Thank you. Oopsie. Okay, so just like Rosalie, the computer has to get used has to get used to my commands. So there are great advantages for corporates to become engaged with biodiversity credits. There's 3 dimensions that I would like to point out and also elaborate a bit further on them in the coming slides. So one is to mitigate supply chain risks. As you all know, the economy depends on nature, and a lot of companies depend on nature, even though sometimes we don't realize it, how much it is actually used, that it is really important to keep nature safe and sound in order to be able to perform the activities and actions of companies in the future, and to keep our economy also strong. Then to strengthen the brand reputation internally and externally. So employees as well as customers and consumers, they are looking at biodiversity, at nature topics, climate and nature topics, as we all know. So this is also a very good advantage to if you get engaged with biodiversity credits. And there are some regulatory requirements that are already being implemented or that are upcoming in the near future that can also be served through biodiversity credits. And I will go into a bit more details in a second. But first, just a little deep dive into this supply chain risks. This is a nice statistic to show how many different industries are dependent either directly or indirectly on nature or natural resources. And you can see almost all industries are somehow involved, and they are either highly dependent or at least medium dependent on nature. And therefore, it is in all of our interest to really conserve our natural resources. Regarding the brand reputation, there is a survey that has been conducted by Deloitte that shows that about 1/3 of UK adults are very concerned about biodiversity, and they would consider biodiversity when making a purchase, and they think that protecting and supporting biodiversity is important. And the development or the trend is going up. So as biodiversity is also covered more and more by the press in close relationship with the climate crisis, the interest in this topic is rising, and therefore, and the younger generation also is quite interested in these topics that will be likely to increase. And therefore, it is of high value to companies to really show their engagement with nature and biodiversity in the future. And the third topic was the regulatory environment, which is always quite complex. And there are many regulations that are already in place, like I said, will be introduced in the near future. And these are some examples from the EU and the UK. So the EU taxonomy, you might be familiar with that, is a classification framework that's part of the Green Deal that will bring more transparency on environmental impacts of corporates. So activities of companies can be classified as taxonomy aligned, for example, and that shows that they are sustainable. And biodiversity credits can enhance this taxonomy alignment of a corporate, and therefore is of an advantage for the company. Then we have closely related to that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which makes it compulsory for companies to report on goals, activities, and impacts on the environment. And if you look at these topics, the environmental topics that are being covered or that need to be covered, you can see that biodiversity is actually a topic by itself, but also water and marine or pollution, climate change, all related also to biodiversity credit projects. And this is required for almost all companies in the EU starting next year, and many of them already are required to report on that this year. And similarly in the UK, there are regulations coming up as part of the Environment Act. That's still in progress, but that will also include, for example, corporate disclosure guidelines, which will probably be outlined in the coming months. and that will be quite similar to what I just described for the EU guidelines. So this is the regulatory environment in a nutshell, just to show the importance and how this can be connected to biodiversity credits. What is important to consider when a corporate becomes active in biodiversity credits? There is frameworks that kind of propose how to do this, and it's very similar on how to get engaged with carbon credits or in general emission reductions. So first of all, a company needs to assess their impacts on and the dependencies on biodiversity to understand where they stand. Then you have to set science-based targets, what needs to be done in the future or what can be improved. And then, of course, most importantly, it's the acting part. So most important of all is to avoid and reduce the impact on nature, similarly to the emission reductions and avoidances in the climate business, but also to restore and regenerate nature. And this is where biodiversity credits can, of course, help to form partnerships with projects that can help on this acting part. And for the transparency in the market, very important is to track and monitor the progresses, and then obviously to disclose them publicly to provide full transparency. Once again, we wanted to compare carbon credits and biodiversity credits. Toril has done that in the beginning as well. But again, we wanted to point out that these biodiversity credits provide an additional investment opportunity to carbon credits. And it kind of is part of the journey to move from a net zero to a nature positive journey, which kind of goes beyond the climate and emission reduction strategies, but into really focus on many nature dimensions, including biodiversity and of course also still climate. What we like about biodiversity credits, also keeping in mind that there is a strong need, a strong desire on the market to have quality assurances in the carbon market. What we like about biodiversity credits is that we have a kind of built-in quality control, because if you remember the different dimensions and aspects that are being measured that Toril described, there are actually many ways to see whether this project is a success, whether you recreate or conserve a fully functional ecosystem. So we see the complexity of biodiversity credits that require a bit more thoughts to actually to find a common a unit as opposed to 1 ton of carbon. It's actually also an advantage because you have this built-in quality control and you measure with the biodiversity credit also the outcomes, the true outcomes and success of a project. Yeah, and finally, my last slide is really, again, to motivate companies to get engaged with biodiversity projects. How can you do this? It's already a great start that you are here and you stay informed, and hopefully you've seen that biodiversity credits are really far and very well developed by now, so we can all get started and dive into the topic. At this stage, you can help shape the market. We will ask you kindly to fill out a survey about biodiversity credits so we can understand better the current situations at companies that will help us to further develop the market into the right direction. And Kaya will say a bit more about this afterwards. And then comes the fun part, to get to know these great projects, which all have a wonderful conservation or restoration story that come with them. And if you like one and get excited about one and that fits to your needs and goals of your company, then it is the right decision to invest into these projects through biodiversity credits, which will also make you one of the pioneers in this area, and you can set great examples, because you've seen it's developing fast, and it's an important market, and we hope that you will be just as excited about this as we are, and get more involved with us in the future about this. So I'll hand over to Kaya.
Thank you so much. Could you possibly flip just to the last slide? Perfect. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think it gave a really good overview of kind of the standard, an example project, and why sort of the private sector should get involved and all the benefits that comes with that. As Nicola mentioned, one of the priorities of this webinar is to get all of you to fill out a survey that we've designed. So Blue Marine Foundation, Plan Vivo Foundation, Goodcarbon, and Flora and Fauna. We've designed a survey to kind of target specifically the private sector to better understand what the priorities are for potential credit buyers, to help us as standard setters and as projects to develop and market these credits that fit the best with the demand, and therefore hopefully increasing demand for these nature positive credits. So there is the QR code here. We will also be sending out the QR code and a link in an email as a follow-up to this webinar. The survey takes less than 10 minutes, so it should be hopefully quite quick and straightforward, but it will provide hopefully really interesting insights on what the priorities are, what is valued from a private sector perspective in a biodiversity credit, and therefore kind of help us inform how we work going forward. So again, thank you very much, and please continue to put questions into the Q&A box, and I will try to shoot some off now, and if our panelists could answer them as quickly but as informatively as possible, that would be great. So we have a question for Toril first on pricing of credits, on what we see the price of these credits to be as they come out.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. Hi, everyone. I'm still here. I'm not sure if you can see me. My screen image seems to have gone black. Apologies for that, but I'm still here and I can hear you. Yeah, so on the pricing of credits, as the market is still emerging, we don't definitively know what credits will be priced at. However, what we are doing is providing guidance and more kind of information for projects to price their credits at what it takes as a minimum to do the work on the ground. So that means implementation and operation costs, the cost of monitoring and doing data analysis, as well as the opportunity costs that may be lost from converting into a biodiversity credit project. And then also for rewarding the projects for doing the work. So the price really should reflect all of this. The other aspect that relates to pricing of biodiversity credits is the element of high integrity and transparency. When we look for credibility in these credit types, we want to have all the assurances of validation and verification through third parties and issuances on a registry. And so through that approach, these things do cost. And so to ensure high integrity, the market should also be prepared to pay for high integrity. And that is what the biodiversity credits should be priced at. I will just mention that pricing of the credits is very much linked to the story behind the project. And from Plan Vivo's perspective, particularly, we see all our projects as being very bespoke, individual with their own unique story. And that comes to what the project sees as reasonable and effective as a pricing guidance or mechanism for their own project.
Great, thank you so much. The link for the survey is also in the chat, so kind of as many access points as possible. We have a question for Nicola. Are you expecting a different type of buyer for nature credits compared with carbon credits? Is this aimed to be as well as carbon credits or instead of? So you kind of touched on this, but maybe a bit more explanation and possibly how new frameworks like the TNFD will kind of separate or combine those two.
Yeah, no, we see the different, not a different type of buyer, but rather the same buyers. Even though it's definitely an expansion in addition to carbon credits. First of all, you can expand the range of projects that are eligible to generate biodiversity credits, because you can now also invest in nature-based solution projects that are not really carbon strong, it's very strong on the carbon side, for example, coral reef restoration, for example. So that it just widens opportunities for corporates, and it expands from this net zero approach towards the nature positivity approach that includes just several dimensions, and not only carbon, which remains important, but also the biodiversity aspects. And there are also some frameworks next to the regulatory ones that I touched upon. There are these voluntary ones from different initiatives, like the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for example, that can be applied to report and act on involving nature-related dependencies and impacts. This is something where biodiversity credits can also be included. And there is SBTN, for example. You might be familiar with SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now it's Science-Based Targets Network. SBTI has the focus on a framework for how to properly act on reducing emissions and also compensating emissions in the carbon context. And the SBTN is now focusing on more nature related topics, including biodiversity. So we see it more as a development of the market, again, not forgetting the carbon credits, but rather combining them.
Perfect, thank you so much. And kind of following on to that is we're getting a couple of questions about stacking. So I think, Toril, you can take these, but how do you foresee carbon credits and biodiversity credits interacting on the same site? And kind of on top of that, there have been some commentators stating that if carbon credits are additional, then biodiversity credits from the same site cannot be additional, and vice versa, as in they cancel each other out. How do we feel about this? So it's kind of a related question that can build on Nicola's answer.
Yeah, sure. So I think first off, it's worth saying that some projects will be more relevant for carbon crediting mechanisms, whereas others may be more relevant to biodiversity. And that is where we see an opportunity for biodiversity credits to be different. But there are definitely projects where stacking is the most suitable financing mechanism, that carbon credits alone aren't able to finance all the activities and interventions that are needed by that project. All of our projects will have to be able to conduct a thorough barrier analysis to demonstrate that additional finance is required, and that additional interventions and activities will be conducted through the additional revenue stream, essentially. With this, we are still working out how exactly it will be applied across different crediting schemes. At the moment, we see it as working within Plan Vivo, so you would be able to stack between Plan Vivo biodiversity credits and Plan Vivo carbon credits. And you would, as I said, need to be able to demonstrate clear additionality through a barrier analysis and understanding of the threats that face that environment.
Perfect, thank you so much. This one is possibly for Rosalie and Toril together. How do we find out about the potential biodiversity problem of a specific habitat? Do we need a specialist study group, or can we just ask for an existing biodiversity project to participate? So maybe, Rosalie, you can touch on how it's been done for the Solent, and then Toril, you can explain a bit more how it fits into the Plan Vivo methodology.
Just unmuting myself. Yeah, so in the Solent project, there's a whole range of methods that we use to assess current biodiversity. So some of the ones I mentioned and were on the slide earlier. In a marine habitat, obviously it's quite tricky, but we're basically applying the terrestrial methods underwater. So things like transect surveys of, say, an oyster reef. So you can do that with a towed video camera, and things like intertidal surveys, where you do transects across a seagrass bed that's intertidal or subtidal, and then drop down video surveys to get a quadrat photo. And all of these approaches combine to give a picture of what the benthic biodiversity is at these sites, so the seafloor biodiversity, and then the towed video surveys can give you an idea of things like fish communities. And I know Tora will know a lot more about Plan Vivo's specific requirements for different habitats on how you should assess your biodiversity baseline. But in the Solent, we use methods like that, and I see it as basically taking terrestrial traditional survey methods and putting them underwater where possible. I hope that answers some of it, but Tora, maybe you'll have a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I think if I understood the question correctly around identifying the potential biodiversity problems for a particular environment, I think one thing that we look for as a certification is a project needs to kind of identify what is their long-term theory of change, what are the objectives they're trying to achieve, and what is the logic behind the project. And that will then inform whether you're trying to restore a particular environment, or are you trying to protect and conserve what is already high value and existing there. You have to conduct stakeholder consultations to understand what are the particular groups, species groups that are important for that habitat. What are the ecosystem services that provide resources, not just to the community, but to the environment and the climate. So it's a very holistic approach that you need to do your research on the project area or the site to understand what the problems are and how to restore that. And what are your milestones, progress indicators, monitoring indicators, and that will really help you to define the project and design the project. But as I said, it needs to be participatory so that you are understanding the complexities from all aspects, not just from a biodiversity aspect, but also from a community and climate aspect as well. So I think that's more broad. If, you know, when it comes to the specifics around monitoring, that will again be specific to the project. What groups are you looking at, if it's marine versus terrestrial? And Plan Vivo are putting together more guidance for this, but it does require a bit of research and thinking about the long-term vision for the project area.
Great, thanks both so much. I think one more question, I know we're at time already, but just to note, if you have any more questions, there are some emails there that you can email regarding who you want to ask those questions to. But the sort of last question, and it's a big one, so for Toril, will biodiversity credits face similar criticisms or skepticism that the carbon credits face? How do you ensure integrity? And I know you touched on this, but I think it's a really important question that we can end on.
Yeah, sure. Let's end on a bang. Of course, we're very cognizant of this, but it's also important to recognize the huge advances that the carbon market have made towards biodiversity restoration and conservation. And we're trying to take on the positive lessons and also improve on some of the areas that we know we can do better. We're trying to create this trust in the market from the very onset by having a transparent approach, making sure that we're using methodologies that have been reviewed and revised, that have had feedback and input from a huge range of actors so that we can make sure that it is participatory. And then having third-party verification and validation to make sure that these claims and the outcomes are in fact real and verified. So we are trying our best, and we are working alongside lots of other good organizations to create this trust and showcase how projects on the ground really can benefit from this sustainable finance mechanism. And we can be able to see change, not just for biodiversity, but of course for the people involved as well. I don't know if anybody else wants to add. Nicola, maybe?
I just might add 2 points. So one is, again, that like biodiversity credits being that complex, they offer an opportunity, like I mentioned before, as a kind of built-in quality control, because we're measuring so many different dimensions just to actually create a biodiversity credits that's already a quite high quality in the monitoring approach. And the second aspect is to really focus again that on the fact that this is not for compensation, but rather contribution. So there's not offsetting purpose for biodiversity credits, because that is just too hard to compare to whatever impact has been done, or negative impact has been done by corporates, and then offsetting it through biodiversity credits. That is not the goal. So this is all, I guess, one aspect that has been criticized in the past a lot, that is not part of the biodiversity credit scheme.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our attendees and to our panelists. One more urge to fill out the survey. We're probably going to close it at the end of November, so there's plenty of time to have a look. And please do share the webinar recording with any other private sector actors you think might be interested. The more feedback and the more responses, the better. So thank you again so much for attending, and I hope you all have a lovely Tuesday.
Thank you.